On Friday, June 6th, during the Game Awards Summer Game Fest, Ian Proulx, the co-founder of 1047 Games, which is the team behind Splitgate and Splitgate 2, stood up on stage with a Make FPS Great Again hat. Proulx decried the current state of FPS games and subsequently bemoaned the absence of Titanfall 3. This mini diatribe on modern shooters was followed by the announcement of a Battle Royale mode for Splitgate 2. You know, Battle Royale, arguably one of the single biggest elements responsible for the monetary incentive systems of shooter games changing over the last decade or so. Proulx's appearance proved to be so controversial that it resulted in the team issuing a statement that no apology would be coming, an effective doubling down from Splitgate alongside some clarification. Then this was followed up by an apology. I've considered making a video on this moment a handful of times over the last week, but things have been changing so rapidly that I shelved it. The situation has finally stabilized, I think, so I thought I'd try my hand at giving some context as to what's going on here and, as an original Splitgate player, where I think this ends up. Here's my attempt to cover just some of the main reasons this moment drew some ire and why I think the pretty intentionally antagonistic comments made here fell shy of their intended goal. First, I'm going to qualify some of my words here. Though I don't think it's always necessary and is often implied in basically every one of my videos, I'm going to state outright that, of course, this is my opinion. I will try and signpost the moments where I may be guessing intent or just telling you whether or not I agree with why some of the words are being said. Proulx and those who make statements on social media are their own people, but they're also working on behalf of big corporations. You do have to guess intent sometimes, as much as that may suck to navigate. PR statements often benefit from a little bit of haziness and not fully stating an opinion in defined terms. Despite misgivings, I actually do really value how loud Ian Proulx has been about his intent over the last week or so. I think there's an integrity in being able to state loudly, here's what I think and why. It makes conversations easier to navigate and misgivings easier to actually talk through. I would advise actually watching the Splitgate segment from Summer Game Fest, it's linked down below, as I will be mostly summarizing it for a flow and time. Your perspective, not just on the event, but the delivery of some words and phrases will be unique to you, and this video is my perspective. For the sake of this video, I'll split up the central analysis into a few major areas. The first is the game itself. Yes, we will get onto the hat later, but I think some of my analysis will draw back to this section first. After saying, quote unquote, I'm tired of playing the same Call of Duty every year, Proulx says he wishes he could have Titanfall 3. As someone who is quite critical of Call of Duty and also wishes for Titanfall 3, there's definitely part of me that wants to agree here. However, there is something that reads particularly weird about decrying the lack of an original inventive game with a great story mode and fast-paced multiplayer with inventive ideas, only to announce a sequel envisioned as a Halo/arena shooter/Portal FPS game that has surprise launch with a Battle Royale mode complete with expensive microtransactions. In fairness, Splitgate responded to that specific criticism by lowering the price of the most expensive bundle. This is the right call, but it only really goes part of the way to addressing that larger problem. Also, while trying to be fair, I will say my descriptive to the game is reductive, but that is functionally the original elevator pitch. However, despite bringing down the price of that bundle and somewhat shifting the blame to a former monetization head who came from Call of Duty, it's still a very expensive bundle and much more expensive than many just as highly detailed purchases you can make in the COD store.
I called Derek, our lead game designer, and I said, Derek, like, did you know we had an $80 bundle? Like, this is news to me. Like, what the heck? Like, that makes no sense. And he didn't. And essentially what happened is our former head of monetization, who happened to come from Call of Duty, was with us for less than a year and was very aggressive on the pricing. And so actually prior to his departure, we actually originally had founders packs at $100. We had battle passes at $10. And the first thing Derek and I did when we reevaluated everything a month ago was we slashed those things.
It's not hard to see that Splitgate is making a lot of the same decisions that caused COD to land where it is now. It being stale is at least partially related to its breakneck release schedule, and it makes up for any lost revenue by pushing more and more microtransactions on its player base. Given that the first Splitgate died just a few years ago and now we have a new one with an abundant storefront, there's a certain irony to this whole situation. It all feels to me like Call of Duty, being the big guy, is the easy target, and Proulx would prefer to have a loud, eye-catching opinion than none at all. And frankly, I kinda hate that this situation has made me defend COD, a franchise I've been really soured on over the last decade or so. Just a day later, this year's Call of Duty trailer launched, and it's so interestingly framed, it's easy to read it as Remedy. There is some intentionality here and a desire to give some sort of interesting story. Ultimately, I think Proulx's leveling of what COD is actually harmful to the future of the franchise. I've disliked COD quite a bit at different points over the last decade, but there are entire COD games not as interesting conceptually or mechanically as the psychological horror level of Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War. The problem isn't necessarily Call of Duty, but the specific games, and there can be a path forward where they are at least interestingly made. It's hard not to believe that if Titanfall became the big franchise that Proulx wants, it would become subject to the same criticism. Ultimately, Respawn, the team behind Titanfall, were at one point made up of many ex-COD devs, and Titanfall was even believed to be a COD killer early on. Both co-founders of Respawn were also co-founders of Infinity Ward. Respawn is owned by EA now, one of the biggest targets of ire for poor development practices just a decade ago. Oversaturation is real, and I think elements of the narrative of Call of Duty can play into militarism in a way that's almost propagandistic, but the idea of a shooter of its caliber isn't inherently the problem. Proulx's comments feel oversimplified, which, yeah, is just a problem you run into when you have to address a crowd in a small amount of time, but that reductionism can lead to a place where those games actually aren't in any way incentivized to be better. To imply that the last COD game is the exact same as the 2023 Modern Warfare 3 feels either disingenuous or ignorant. Another element of this that reads weirdly is the Battle Royale of it all. It's just one mode in Splitgate 2, but it was arguably the biggest part of the Splitgate segment, and it takes up the biggest real estate of the Splitgate 2 UI right now. Battle Royales marked one of the largest flips for FPS games from single-player/multiplayer hybrid shooters to free-to-play games with wide storefronts. Battle Royales and free-to-play games are part of what shifted the focus of EA, who own Titanfall and Respawn, to focus on Apex Legends, the free-to-play Battle Royale set in the Titanfall universe. Respawn has worked exclusively on Apex Legends, a VR Medal of Honor game, and Star Wars games since the launch of the last Titanfall game, which is technically Titanfall Assault from 2017. The business model of Splitgate is part of the same problem that financially incentivized companies to move away from the same models that supported the first two Titanfall games. Splitgate 2 is a free-to-play shooter, launching after the last game that was effectively abandoned, complete with a store to buy skins and a battle pass. From looking at this game, I don't really know what it is that Proulx even dislikes about Call of Duty. Splitgate has learned from many of the worst parts of those games, and the main difference here is that it's free, which Call of Duty Warzone also is. At least in fairness to Warzone, it has events and changes maps to give players a reason to keep coming back. Many felt a tad hoodwinked by the abandoning of the first Splitgate game, so if you played both Warzone and Splitgate in 2021, there's more of a reason to keep playing the former than the latter. I think there is some attempt to go for that in-your-face rhetoric that Joseph Fares touched on before the launch of It Takes Two or Split Fiction. However, Joseph Fares decried the lack of narrative-driven co-op-only games, then made a narrative-driven co-op-only game. Ian Proulx decried the lack of Titanfall 3, then didn't make anything close to Titanfall 3. However, I do think it's worth noting I don't inherently think free-to-play games or Battle Royale games are a problem in a vacuum, and the existence of them in Splitgate implies the team don't think that either. It makes their statements on the decline of FPS games all feel a tad nebulous, though. When I say Splitgate is part of the same culture that resulted in shooters being the thing they are today, I'm not calling Splitgate 1 or 2 bad. I actually think both games have/had a ton of potential, and the Splitgate 2 Battle Royale mode does feel like its own thing in the market. Here's where I'll give the team the most credit. Looking at Ian Proux's AMA in response to the launch of the game, it's clear that the team is quite receptive to feedback, admitting fault with its monetization, though passing the blame somewhat. However, I think Proulx felt fairly evasive when asked about the Make FPS Great Again hat in that AMA, a reference to Trump's Make America Great Again hat and presumably not Ronald Reagan's slogan of a similar phrase from the 1980s. He told a commenter, quote-unquote, "The main thing we are doing, besides just not doing things like this again, is to run things by more people to get more perspectives." This is honestly a very constructive way to go about future messaging, but it doesn't address why it happened and what the intent was. This seems to be a fairly popular understanding of Proux's replies in the AMA. When someone asked if there's quote-unquote any disapproval of the political message the hat conveys, among a justification for asking such a question, one account said AMA except for that. I think there's this back and forth of people asking to address, other people saying Proulx doesn't owe them a response, the commenter replying with some form of, yes, Proulx may not owe us that, but he chose to wear a political hat and brought this reaction to himself. He did talk about the hat in his apology, so you could make the argument he addressed it there, but he doesn't really acknowledge how one could read this as political and why the team went for that slogan specifically, nor his rationale around his dislike of COD. Here is where we talk about the hat. I think predictably I may have some comments annoyed at me for talking about politics here. I think that my channel engages with politics, specifically social politics, quite a lot. I said argue they are textual to what I'm talking about, and I'd also argue the same is true here. To talk about the co-founder of a studio referencing a political slogan, and importantly the political slogan of arguably one of the most powerful men in the world, without actually acknowledging the politics of that would feel cowardly and insincere. I owe myself and whoever is watching this video more intellectual honesty than that. To do anything else would be lying by omission. Also, I praise Proulx for at least engaging with the things he says, so I feel like I should do the same. Summer Game Fest 2025 happened in the YouTube Theater in Los Angeles. At the same time, in that same city, many residents of Los Angeles were resisting mass ICE raids due to increased policy pressure from President Donald Trump. Thousands of federal troops have been deployed to forcibly remove people from the country. On the backdrop of this, Trump himself has consistently argued against the legal processes afforded to potential immigrants, forcibly detaining and deporting them. Not only do immigrants make up much of the foundation of America itself, but LA is uniquely shaped by it, with cultural artifacts like food and art being direct results of immigrant diasporas. The Department of Homeland Security put out an official press release on June 11th entitled DHS reveals more heinous criminal illegal aliens, including a murderer, pedophile, and drug traffickers arrested during Los Angeles operation. According to The Guardian, a spokesperson for the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights of Los Angeles says, "We found no credible evidence to back Homeland Security's claims. These were not targeted arrests, they weren't based on judicial warrants, and the lie won't survive for long." Given LA's designation as a sanctuary city, Trump's smash and grab style ICE raids are being read as particularly authoritarian and unjust, and for good reason. Importantly, these protests aren't just about those raids either. Police crackdown and military enforcement can have a chilling effect on rights to speech and rights to protest. Under the guise of the 1798 law, which declares that those who come from a country the US is at war with can be apprehended, restrained, secured, and removed as alien enemies, Trump has deported over 100 people alleged to be part of a Venezuelan gang to a jail in El Salvador. Many people detained there are not granted due process, and millions of dollars are being funneled there to a prison that is enabling a wider overreach of punitive militarism in the country. This is all while there is room to detain those in America, and this is attributed to the fact that expeditiously usurping traditional legal systems leaves those detained in a country where America doesn't have jurisdiction. Effectively, this, alongside hundreds of other acts over the last few months, contributes to the belief that Trump's overreach is a dangerous sidestepping of things otherwise considered paramount to the fundamentals of America itself. Communication from Trump has been particularly hard to piece together, mostly because he either consistently goes back and forth on things, miscommunicates, or just doesn't understand what's being asked of him. Trump is currently selling a $50 Trump 2028 cap and would not rule out a potential third term, something that is functionally unconstitutional in the US, but also said just a few weeks later that he wouldn't seek a third term. It's important not to understate that pushing for a third term is one of those warning signs of totalitarianism, given it flies in the face of the American legal and political system. This doublespeak that Trump is practically infamous for means that teetering up to the militarism line makes him appear particularly dangerous and disingenuous. I don't bring this up just to tell you Donald Trump is an idiot, though, if the big red hat fits. I bring up these, we'll call them huge and worrying political faux pas, to express the backdrop that this hat possibly unwittingly cites. When Proulx wears his hat referencing arguably one of the biggest slogans of the Trump campaign, this is what many see. The fervor around Trump's name specifically has been made louder and louder as a result of his acts and actions over the last few months, and taking place in LA, the founding ground of recent anti-ICE protests, is only the cherry on top of this militarized cake. To balance out where I think he might be coming at it from, Trump may be a political figure, among other things, but he's also a strong force in culture. His Trumpisms have made their way into memes, conversation, and just general culture. Fake news, very fine people, bigly, there are all these phrases that, when mentioned, don't inherently signal support for the big orange man. Inversely, the hat isn't a misquote. It's not a funny slogan, it's a politically motivating phrase. Now, Proulx isn't the only one to reference this slogan. You find movements to make red hats apolitical again, you find Miley Cyrus wearing a Make America Gay Again hat. However, what makes these different is that they are, in their own way, protests of Trump. They're a tad on the nose, maybe even tasteless or insensitive, but they are fundamentally subversive in nature. The slogans featured in those examples recognize the potentially dictator-sized elephant in the room and leverage the imagery of MAGA to critique it, effectively neutralizing its sting. Meanwhile, Proulx's hat is a genuine belief from the team. It's not just a meme or political parody. It's not supposed to be just a reference. Given the ideological basis of the red hat wearers, it raises questions about what greatness truly means in the eyes of Proulx and his team. And I think this is part of where that disconnect comes from. Signaling a slogan that mimics a genuine one from the Trump campaign could not have come at a worse time, and he couldn't have done it in a worse city. The day after the Splitgate 2 segment, Proulx said in a tweet, "I'm not here to apologize, but I am here to clarify. This is not a political statement, it's quite literally what it says, so take it at face value." The problem is that it is a political statement, and saying something isn't doesn't really stop it from being so. As flawed as this statement was, it was enough to mobilize quite a lot of support from openly right-wing accounts in the replies to this tweet, though, to be fair, Twitter has become a hotbed for right-wing accounts. A lot of the replies rely on language like triggering and cancelling, which signals where exactly they lie. One account says, quote unquote, "I mean it is what it is, if people are going to try and cancel you for that hat, I can assure you they were never going to buy your game in the first place anyway," which is a funny thing to say about a free-to-play game, as they don't buy the game. This is a bit nitpicky, of course, and could just be a simple mistake, but it could also signal them being more interested in the culture war scuffle than the game itself. But all of this tiptoes around the point here. There's quite a lot of conversation about what is even meant by the hat, and that's one of the biggest unanswered questions I found in the AMA. A chunk of the fans are confused about what the point is and want some sort of clarification of where the team lies, and given Proulx is signaling a very specific messaging here, I don't think it's unreasonable to ask. There's an odd sensitivity felt in the Twitter comment section to the idea of someone wanting more clarity around the messaging the team chooses to do. It's not like Proulx was put on the spot. He was given an allotted time in a show and told to fill it. This was the messaging he chose to stand by. I believe there to be quite a bit of dishonesty in this comment section, knowingly or not. It feels to me like a group of people immediately in spin mode, very unwilling to acknowledge what's being asked, and I'll elaborate on why. One comment said, quote unquote, "When you satirize the president's slogan, it's pretty obvious it's political." This was hit with similarly nonsensical and dishonest insults. "Don't be such a pussy," replies one comment, "so fragile," said another. The insults are functionally an obfuscation. The original comment makes the argument that the hat is a political message, whether intentionally or not, and the replies are derision without an argument. Obviously, not everyone is expected to formulate the most nuanced and elegant reply, but most of the replies here amount to attacking and sneering for the simple act of arguing that a hat referencing the political slogan of the current sitting president could be political. This doublespeak is reminiscent of the same doublespeak I think Trump engages with. That doublespeak becomes even worse when some are using Make America Great Again imagery in the comments section too. This same account, by the way, is a self-admitted griper, sharing anti-Semitic and racist memes constantly. Needless to say, this isn't indicative of all the comments, it's just something you see a decent amount of in these sorts of PR situations recently, especially around games. This implied claim that it's not political, but even if it was, it's good. In Splitgate 2's case, there's an odd amount of support for a non-political hat by explicitly political accounts, but in their support for Splitgate, they don't put that political belief up front. They often hide behind accusing others of being sensitive or claiming the hat isn't political. And I think given its June, people noticed Proulx would wear a hat referencing Trump, but didn't include any sort of pride bundle or cosmetics to my knowledge. Doing one thing and claiming it's not political and not doing the other, assumedly because it may be read as political, does come across as particularly tactical and tactless. They could, of course, introduce a pride cosmetic, but it still reads as quite strange this month. The likes of Counter-Strike 2 doesn't have Pride Month editions, but the team also have never done anything as closely linked to Trump as Proulx's hat, to my knowledge. From the initial response and the later apology, I can believe Proulx's intent. I think there's some sort of attempt to be inflammatory and eye-catching, but I don't believe the explicit intent is to signal support for Republicans, specifically MAGA Republicans. If that were the case, Proulx could have quite easily doubled down here, but he didn't. He says multiplayer FPS games are stale and says they want to fix it with their modes. That again sort of reminds me of what Joseph Fares does. I think there's a chance that Proulx wants to be the guy wearing sunglasses as an explosion goes off behind him, not the guy putting the hat on as he runs straight into it. And in a sense, I don't believe it was ever Proulx's intent to actually pull in this crowd. The AMA constantly responding to fans on Reddit, engaging with the community by setting up nights where the team plays so other players can earn a developer skin. To me, Proulx comes across as a little too open to play such a cowardly game like the replies are. However, I do think that some of his messaging around the hat has been careful. I feel he may have walked into a position that is hard for him to recover from without losing players somewhere. Let's finally move into Proulx's apology. It's a few minutes long, so I'd advise looking at it yourself. He says, quote unquote, it's really hard as an independent studio to break through the noise. He says their trailer at the Game Awards didn't really have an impact because there are so many other great trailers present. Comparing figures, the Splitgate 2 world premiere trailer at SGF currently has 1.9 million views, and the Game Awards 2024 trailer from 6 months ago has 53,000. This implies there is some truth to what he's saying. However, a launch trailer for a new game mode will naturally get more than an update trailer. The Splitgate 2 cinematic announcement trailer from 10 months ago currently has 5.3 million views and is the YouTube channel's most popular public video right now. It's true that it's really tough for independent teams to break through the noise, but Splitgate 2 isn't just a random game. The original Splitgate has an all-time concurrent player record of 67,724, and Splitgate 2 has received multiple trailers at events hosted by the Game Awards. He says in the apology video that Proulx didn't intend for the hat to be taken as a political message in any way whatsoever. He said they knew there would be some controversy, whatever that means, which does imply they were looking to manipulate emotions to some degree to get a little coverage, but that ultimately the team saw it as a meme and a vehicle to get across their broader disappointment in the genre right now. Rather predictably, one of the accounts that said people are getting triggered over a hat then became annoyed at this apology and further transparency. It's hard not to feel like they're playing the same game that they're accusing others of and are just as sensitive and reactive as what they deemed the other side to be, but flipped. Ultimately, it's just as fickle and lacking in nuance too. The same account that said, quote unquote, if people are going to try and cancel you for that hat, I can assure you they were never going to buy your game in the first place anyway, then put out their own video accusing Proulx of bending the knee. I think these videos feel just as manipulative as the original hat, but also they're willing and able to exert the same social pressure they complained about others using. Not only is this the case, but it's implied that any belief, imagined or otherwise, that agrees with them is a real feeling, and anything to the contrary, or even intended to give more context on what they say, is implied to be insincere. And I can't help but feel like the entire attention economy fueling the cranking out of multiple off-the-cuff videos about fairly nuanced things that require time and research is driven by a lack of any grace or charitability. This is part of why I try to directly signal where I think I'm making guesses as to why and where thoughts are formed throughout this video, but also why I go to great lengths to try and give context on why I drew those conclusions. At least if you disagree, you can point to where and we can discuss it, but these tweets don't even understand the context of the game or where the opposition is coming from. I will be wrong on this channel, that's not a guess, it's a guarantee. However, I don't make a point of hiding behind snide jokes and insincerity. I put my thoughts and feelings up front, whatever they may be, and I hope this leads to a place where those critical of me can talk about why. I engage quite a lot with comments, and I do this on principle. I've no interest in the contrary. In a Reddit post about the apology, Proulx says he understands quote-unquote it might come off as backpedaling, but better late than never, and you can tell in the video that he knows some will accuse him of being insincere, but he made the apology anyway. From this apology to the explanation the day after Summer Game Fest, Proulx does seem quite preoccupied with stopping people from misunderstanding him. This is why when I see people accusing him of being cowardly, it's hard to think that's fair or just. Proulx is very clearly aware of how he'll be perceived, but did it anyway. It would be more cowardly to do nothing. Almost every video I've found that's critical of Proulx's apology labels him as effectively lying and bending the knee, which is intended to hint at a conspiratorial power pressuring him into doing the opposite, but why would that power be necessary if the hat isn't political? This doublespeak is so effective because it's transient and ever shifting. Those goalposts are ever moving, and they rely on you not having the time to ever catch up. A significant portion of the feedback on this apology video is quite manipulative and coaxed in language that draws non-conclusions without any evidence. One of the biggest bits of feedback from those critical of the apology is that those who don't like the hat and what it represents don't even play games anyway, and now he's scaring away the real fans. A few are even saying they're uninstalling and stop playing due to the apology, which is the exact same sensitivity they previously ridiculed. Many comments accuse him of folding, bending the knee, and some say that the previous hat showed they have some balls and a moral compass. And I have to ask again, if this isn't political, what moral compass has suddenly changed by apologizing for the hat? Now, I do understand that it may sound a little silly to point out logical flaws by blue checkmark accounts on Twitter, but this builds to a grander point, which is Proulx is very engaged with his community, and that hat has somehow drawn a large amount of big right-wing accounts, armchair analyzing player figures based on what they perceive the politics of those players to be. I don't know where this belief comes from, other than a willingness to believe it's true. Splitgate 1's peak concurrent players were higher than Splitgate 2 without any controversy. Splitgate 2 has a steeper climb in some ways, and I think this is partially because the abandoning of the first game left a bad taste in some players' mouths, but also the first game came at a good time. 2021 still felt the effects from the start of COVID in 2020, and it was a free-to-play game that picked up the nostalgia of Halo, Unreal Tournament, and Portal in a time where none of these games really had much of a presence. We wouldn't get Halo Infinite until December 8th, and there was actually a little spike in players the weekend before Halo Infinite, one that was comparably much bigger than the preceding weekend. Looking at SteamDB, the drop of players for Splitgate 2 after the apology seems to align with trends with the game, i.e. people going to sleep, waking up, and people playing less during the week, and then a slight bump at the weekend. June 9th to June 10th dropped by about 3,000 players at peak. June 10th, the day of the apology, to June 11th dropped by over 3.5 thousand players. June 11th to June 12th dropped by just under 3,000 players at both peaks. June 12th to June 13th dropped by about 1,000 concurrent players at each peak. Then June 13th to June 14th grew by about 1,000 concurrent players at each peak. All of these drops and rises seem to match what you would expect from a game of its caliber. We saw roughly similar trends with the original Splitgate. Its peak was 67,724 on August 8th. August 9th dropped down to 64,810. It went up momentarily on August 10th by 2,000, then back down to 64,000 again on August 11th. It went down to a peak of 61 the next day, then 58 the day after. It leveled out to a similar play count for a few days, then dipped to 43,000 on August 8th, shot back up, and then slowly faded off. Though we don't have player figures on other platforms, so we can't really speak to that, it seems like the apology had little to no effect either way on the player count on Steam specifically. And whatever drop-off is there doesn't account for the fact that people had issues with monetization and felt the leveling system was a bit shallow. If we look at the user reviews on Steam for Splitgate 2, we can actually see most of its negative reviews came on June 7th. On June 10th, Splitgate 2 on Steam got less negative reviews than 2 days prior or 2 days after. This implies that it didn't really have an effect. Games with overt left-wing messaging do sell and some don't. I can't honestly draw conclusions much grander than that, and without being able to poll a significant user base of these games, neither can anyone else. And that leads me to ask, how does one read an account saying they aren't your customers for some nebulous reason or another, but I am, and you've lost my business by not bending the knee to me, without feeling like that's incredibly manipulative? And realistically, Splitgate would be healthier without being a fad for any crowd. This is going to sound reductive, but Proulx has all these eyes on him now, and the best thing Splitgate 2 can do is be worth that attention. It drew ire for multiple reasons, but the launch isn't everything for the game, and whether it flourishes or flounders, I feel a very specific crowd will take a victory lap either way. What are facts but opinions to crush under a mass of tweets and a blue check that costs you $8 a month? Thank you for watching my video or listening to my video, my TED Talk on Splitgate 2. Apologies for the voice this week. Hay fever is just killing me, so I just sound consistently sick and will for a couple of weeks. but I hope you liked it anyway. This was a weird one to write, and I went back and forth a lot on it, but I felt like I had something to say by the end, and I feel like that's as good a reason to do it as any. There was one tidbit I wanted to get into the video, but I cut it out because it didn't really add to it, which is that in a response on Reddit, Proulx said that he'd love to do a single player version of the game, but you can't expect it anytime soon with their current resources. It ended up being not that relevant, but I feel like if you like Splitgate and you want to see a single player, that's probably information that's important to you in some way. I'd like to see them do it. I feel like it's hard to praise Titanfall 2 without looking at how great that single player was. Like, it's so inventive and fun, and I remember really liking the characters as well, which I think those sort of yearly FPS games kind of lack in sometimes. Titanfall just, it captured something, didn't it? It's, well, Titanfall 2. I remember getting that and that year's COD as a child, and it took me a while to get around to Titanfall 2, but it really stayed in my brain more than whatever COD I would have played that year. I don't even remember which one it was. But either way, yeah, thank you for watching. If you liked this, please subscribe. I've learned recently that doing a please subscribe thing earlier on helps, but I really didn't want to cut off the middle of this video by saying, no, while you're here, subscribe, because it felt a little serious, I guess. There's a couple of little jokey things that I cut out of this script because I just felt like maybe that pure information is the better route. It ended up being thousands and thousands of words long, and it wasn't intended to be initially. I just started writing and that's what came out. So I hope you enjoyed or found it in any way insightful or considered, at least. That's what I was going for. Thank you.